The blood oath circles smelled like wet iron and crushed juniper berries, and Sarah's knees ached against the cold stone floor where she had been kneeling since before dawn. Her wrists were bound in front of her with ceremonial rope, the kind braided from wolfsbane fiber that left chemical burns on Omega's skin. The burns had started blistering 2 hours ago. She could feel the fluid collecting under the skin of her inner wrists, each pulse of her heartbeat sending a small, precise spike of pain up through her forearms. She kept her breathing even. She had learned over 19 years in the Ashfall pack that showing pain was an invitation. Around her, the oath hall was filling with bodies. She could hear them more than see them because her head was supposed to stay bowed. Boots on stone, the rustle of ceremonial levers. Low murmurs that stopped whenever someone glanced toward her and then resumed, slightly louder, as if she were a stain on the floor that everyone had agreed to talk around. Today was the day the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion would arrive to accept Ashfall's blood oath of fealty. Every pack within 600 miles had already knelt. Ashfall was last, and not by choice. They had resisted for 3 years, and the resistance had cost them half their warriors, most of their trade routes, and whatever dignity their alpha, Rendell, had left. Sarah was part of the price. She had been told this 4 days ago, in the pack kitchen where she worked as the night shift cleaner. Not a cook, not even a kitchen assistant, the one who scrubbed the grease traps and mopped the stone floors after everyone else had gone to sleep. Rendell's beta, a thick-necked man named Corvin, had walked in at 2 in the morning while she was on her hands and knees scraping carbonized fat from the base of the industrial oven. He had not looked at her face. He had looked at the back of her neck where her pack brand was, the small scarred circle that marked her as property. 12 Omegas, he had said. The Alpha King demands 12 Omegas as part of the oath. You were number 12, she had not argued. There was no point in arguing with Corvin, who communicated exclusively in declarations, and who once dislocated a teenage Omega's shoulder for asking why. What she had done, after he left, was press her forehead against the warm metal of the oven door and close her eyes and count her heartbeats until they slowed. Then she had finished cleaning the grease trap. The fat had congealed into a yellowish paste that smelled like burnt rosemary and old lamb. She scraped it into the waste bin methodically, thinking about nothing, which was a skill she had perfected over many years. Now she knelt in the oath circle with 11 other Omegas, all of them bound, all of them silent. She was at the end of the row, closest to the eastern wall, where a draught crept through a crack in the mortar and pressed against her bare arms like cold fingers. She was wearing the ceremonial shift they had given her, which was thin, undyed cotton that did nothing against the chill of an early November morning in the mountains. The Omega next to her, a girl named Pell, who was maybe 16, was trembling so hard her teeth were clicking. Sarah could not reach out to touch her because of the binding, so she pressed her knee sideways until it rested against Pell's knee. The girl's trembling slowed slightly. Not much. Enough. Sarah had a scar that ran from her left collarbone to the base of her throat. She had gotten it at 14, when Rendell's daughter Maren had pushed her down a flight of stone stairs for the offense of making eye contact. The scar had healed badly because no one had cleaned it or stitched it, and the tissue had thickened into a raised white ridge that pulled at her skin when she turned her head to the left. She had other scars. The burn on her right shoulder blade from a cooking accident. That was not an accident. The thin lines on her palms from the year she spent spitting firewood for the entire pack compound, because Rendell had decided it built Omega character. But the one on her throat was the one people noticed, and it was the one that made Maren smile every time she saw it. A small proprietary smile, the way you might smile at a piece of furniture you had picked out yourself. Maren was here now, somewhere behind Sarah. She could smell her perfume, synthetic vanilla and something floral that was supposed to be expensive but smelled, to Sarah's quietly excellent nose, like a department store sample counter. Maren was 23, beautiful in the way that well-fed daughters of powerful men tend to be beautiful, and she was Rendell's choice for the offering to the Alpha King. Not as an Omega, as a potential mate. Rendell was hoping the Alpha King would see Maren's wheat blonde hair and wide-set blue eyes and decide to take her as his Luna instead of merely accepting Ashfall's surrender. Sarah thought this was unlikely, but she kept that thought where she kept most of her thoughts, behind her teeth. The horns sounded, 3 long notes that shook dust from the ceiling beams and vibrated in Sarah's sternum. The hall went silent with a particular quality of silence that meant everyone had simultaneously stopped breathing. Pell's trembling got worse. Sarah pressed her knee harder against the girl's. The doors at the far end of the Oath Hall opened and cold air poured in, carrying the scent of pine sap and frost, and underneath those, something else. Something that hit Sarah's senses like a fist. It was a smell she had no name for. It was dark and warm at the same time, like wood smoke from a fire built with cedar. But underneath that there was something alive, something electric, like the air before a summer storm when the ozone builds and the hair on your arm stands up. Her wolf, the wolf she had spent 6 years pretending did not exist, the wolf she had buried so deep inside herself that most of the pack genuinely believed she was wolfless. That wolf lifted his head for the first time in years and made a sound inside her chest. Not a growl, not a whine. A recognition. Sarah kept her head down. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain Pell could feel it through their touching knees. She focused on the blisters on her wrists, on the pain, using it as an anchor. She could not afford this, whatever this was. She could not afford it. The footsteps that entered the hall were heavy and deliberate, the stride of someone who had never in his life needed to hurry. She counted 6 sets of boots, a royal guard, and one set that was different from the others, not louder but somehow denser, as if the stone floor itself was paying attention to where those feet fell. Alpha Kale Dravas, King of the Northern Dominion, walked past the rows of kneeling pack members and into the oath circle. Sarah knew the exact moment he crossed the threshold of the circle because the temperature in the room seemed to change. Not warmer or cooler, heavier. As if gravity had opinions, she could see his boots. That was all she allowed herself. Black leather, well worn but maintained, the kind of boots that had seen mud and blood and been cleaned carefully afterward, because the man who wore them respected his tools. They stopped 6 feet in front of the Omega line. Rendell's voice, pitched higher than usual in a way he probably thought sounded respectful but actually sounded like a man trying not to choke on his own tongue, began the oath recitation. On behalf of the Ashfall Pack, I, Rendell Voss, Alpha of the Western Range, do hereby submit to the authority of the Northern Crown and offer blood oath of fealty to Alpha King Kale Dravos, ruler of the Northern Dominion, shield of the 7 territories, breaker of the litany of titles went on. Sarah had heard Rendell practicing them last night through the kitchen floor, pacing in his study above, stumbling over the pronunciation of Dominion 3 times. She had been mopping and had thought, with the detached clarity that comes from exhaustion, that a man who could not pronounce his conqueror's titles probably should not have tried to resist his conqueror in the first place. The boots in front of her shifted, 1 step closer. That smell intensified. Cedar smoke and storm air and something underneath that was purely animal, purely wolf, a musk that had no chemical equivalent, because it was the scent of an apex predator in its prime. Sarah's buried wolf clawed at the inside of her ribs, and she clenched her jaw so hard her molars ached. Rendell finished his recitation. There was a pause. Then a voice spoke, and Sarah understood immediately why Pax surrendered to this man. The voice was low and unhurried, with a roughness at its edges like a blade that had been sharpened so many times the stone had left texture in the steel. It was not loud. It did not need to be. I accept Ashfall's oath, the Alpha King said, but I do not accept this. Another pause, longer. Sarah became aware that the smell was closer, much closer. The boots moved again, and now they were directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the scuff on the left toe, a pale mark in the leather where something had scraped across it. Why are her wrists bound with wolfsbane rope? It was not a question. It was shaped like one, but delivered with the flat certainty of a man who already knew the answer and wanted to hear someone else try to justify it. Rendell's voice, even higher now. The Omegas are bound according to tradition, Alpha King. It signifies their willing submission to. I asked about her. Not them. her. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight and texture that presses against the eardrums. Sarah felt a hand under her chin. The touch was not gentle exactly, but it was careful, the way you might handle something you suspected was more fragile than it looked. Her face was tilted upward, and for the first time she saw the Alpha King. He was enormous. That was the first thing, the unavoidable thing. Not just tall, though he was tall, well over 6.5 feet. He was built like something designed for violence, and then refined, broad through the shoulders and chest, with a narrowness through the waist that spoke of muscle earned through use, not vanity. His hair was black and cut short, close to his skull, and his jaw was heavy and clean-shaven, and marked with a scar that ran from below his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a thin, pale line that pulled his expression into something that looked like a permanent, almost smile on one side. His eyes were the amber gold of a wolf in full shift, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made her feel like she was standing in front of a furnace with the door open. She could not breathe. His wolf was right there, right behind those eyes, and it was massive. She could feel it pressing against the surface of him like something trapped under ice. And her wolf, her hidden, buried, denied wolf, responded. She felt it rise inside her chest like a tide, pushing against the cage she had built for it, and the effort of holding it down made her vision blur at the edges. The Alpha King's nostrils flared, his pupils dilated, the amber swallowed by black for just a moment before contracting again. His hand on her chin did not move, but his thumb shifted, tracing the edge of her jaw, and she felt the touch everywhere, in her fingertips, in the soles of her feet, in the hollow behind her sternum where her wolf was howling silently. "Mate," his wolf said through his voice, barely a whisper, raw and involuntary, the kind of sound that a man makes when he has been punched in the chest. Sarah did not respond. She could not. Her throat had closed. His gaze dropped to the wolfsbane rope on her wrists, and his expression changed. The almost smile disappeared. What replaced it was something Sarah had seen only once before in her life, on the face of a she-wolf who had found her pup dead. Rage so complete it went past heat and into a kind of absolute zero. He let go of her chin. He straightened. He turned to face Rendell, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped half an octave into a register that vibrated in the stones. "You bound my mate in wolfsbane." The hall erupted. Not in sound, in movement. Every wolf in the room flinched simultaneously, a ripple of involuntary submission that passed through the crowd like wind through grass. 2 of Rendell's betters dropped to their knees without deciding to. Naren, somewhere behind Sarah, made a sound that was either a gasp or the beginning of a scream that she swallowed. Rendell's face, which Sarah could now see because she had lifted her head, had gone the color of old tallow, waxy and slightly yellow. His mouth opened and closed twice. The Alpha King reached down and took Soraya's bound wrists in both of his hands. His fingers were warm and rough and very precise. He did not tear the rope. He worked the knot, carefully, quickly, the way someone works a knot when they understand that the material touching the skin is poison and that every second matters. The wolfsbane fibers came away from her blistered wrists, and the relief was so immediate and so intense that Sarah made a sound despite herself, a small exhale that was almost a moan. He dropped the rope on the stone floor. He looked at her wrists, at the raw, blistered skin, and that furnace door expression came back, hotter this time. "Who," he said, still looking at her wrists, "who in this pack has hurt her?" "I want names." "Alpha King," Rendell began. "She is merely an Omega. She has no wolf. She is." The Alpha King looked up from Sarah's wrists, and Rendell stopped talking. It was not a gradual trailing off. It was an immediate, full stop, as if someone had pressed a mute button on his vocal cords. "She is my mate," the Alpha King said. "She is your future queen. And you have kept her in wolfsbane bindings with blisters on her wrists and a scar on her throat that someone in this room gave her. So I will ask one more time, and I will not ask again. Who has hurt her?" The silence was so complete that Sarah could hear the wax dripping from the ceremonial candles at the edges of the oath circle. Slow, thick drops hitting stone. She could hear Pell crying softly beside her. She could hear her own heartbeat, which had not slowed down at all. She stood up, Her legs shook. She had been kneeling for nearly 5 hours, and her muscles had gone stiff and cold and unreliable. But she stood because she had decided something, and when Sarah decided things, her body followed even when it did not want to. "I do not kneel," she said. Her voice came out hoarse and cracked, the voice of someone who had not spoken above a whisper in months. But it was audible. Every wolf in the hall heard it. The Alpha King turned back to her. Those amber eyes, those impossible burning eyes, settled on her face, and she saw something shift in them. Surprise. And then beneath the surprise, something that looked like the beginning of respect. She was looking at the oath circle, the symbols carved into the stone floor, the concentric rings of old blood and older magic. The blood oath required kneeling from both parties. The submitting alpha knelt first, and then the dominant alpha knelt to accept, and their blood mingled in the center channel. It was ancient, it was sacred, and it required the subordinate to kneel, but she was not the subordinate here. She was the offering, the property, the omega with no wolf and no value, traded like a sack of grain for political surrender. And they expected her to kneel. "I have knelt on this stone every day for 6 years, she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The hall was so quiet she could have whispered and been heard in the back row. "I have knelt to scrub it. I have knelt to receive punishment. I have knelt because I was told that kneeling was the only posture my body was designed for." She paused. She breathed. The air tasted like juniper and iron and the cedar smoke scent of the man standing in front of her. "I will not kneel for a blood oath. Not today. Not for anyone." She was aware, in the peripheral way that adrenaline makes you aware of things, that Rendell was staring at her with his mouth open, that Corvin had taken a half-step forward and then stopped because the Alpha King's guards had shifted their weight in a way that communicated a very specific threat, that Maren was gripping the arm of the wolf next to her with both hands, her knuckles white. The Alpha King looked at her for a long time, long enough that the candle wax dripped 3 more times. Long enough that Pell stopped crying and started staring. Then he did something that no one in that hall, including Sarah, expected. He knelt. The Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, the most powerful wolf in 7 territories, the man whose name made other alphas go quiet, lowered himself to one knee on the cold stone of the ashfall oath circle. He moved slowly and deliberately, the way he seemed to do everything, and when his knee touched the stone, the sound it made was barely a tap, but it echoed like a thunderclap because of what it meant. His guard shifted behind him. One of them made a small noise, quickly stifled. The Alpha King looked up at Sarah from his kneeling position, and his expression was something she had never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not lust, not the blank dismissal she was accustomed to. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of equal weight, as if he had looked at her and seen, not the scar and the blisters and the thin cotton shift and the 6 years of grease traps and split firewood, but the thing underneath all of that, the thing she had spent her entire life hiding. "If my mate will not kneel," he said, "then I will." Sarah's wolf broke the surface. She felt it like a crack in a dam, like ice splitting on a river in spring. Not a full shift, not here, not yet, but a surge of presence that flooded her body with heat and made her eyes burn. She knew, without seeing it, that her irises had changed color because the Alpha King's expression sharpened and his nostrils flared again, and his wolf, that enormous presence behind his eyes, pressed forward to meet hers. Her eyes had gone silver, not the amber gold of a standard alpha wolf. Silver like moonlight on water, like the edge of a blade in starlight. It was the color of the old bloodline, the one that had been hunted to extinction 3 centuries ago. The one that every wolf in every territory had been told was gone forever. The lunar bloodline. Several things happened very quickly. Rendell said, "That is not possible." Maren screamed. Corvin lunged forward, and 2 of the Alpha King's guards intersected him with the efficient brutality of men who had been waiting for someone to make a mistake. Corvin hit the stone floor face first, and the sound his nose made when it broke was wet and final. The Alpha King rose from his kneel. He did not rush. He stood between Sarah and the rest of the hall with his back to her, and the width of his shoulders blocked her view of everything except the edges of the room. She realized he was shielding her, positioning his body between her and every wolf in the room. "No one," he said, and his voice had that sub-bass vibration again, the one that made the stones hum. "No one moves toward her. No one speaks to her. No one looks at her with intent. She is under the protection of the Northern Crown, and any wolf who challenges that will die where they stand." Sarah's legs gave out, not from fear. From the sudden absence of the tension she had been carrying for 19 years, the constant low-grade vigilance that had become so normal, she had forgotten it was there until it was gone. She sat down on the cold stone, and the Alpha King turned immediately, dropping to his knee again beside her, his hand on her back, warm and steady. "You are safe," he said. His voice was different now, quieter. The roughness was still there, but the blade had been sheathed. "You are safe, and I am going to take you out of here, and no one in this pack is ever going to touch you again. Do you understand?" She looked at him. This close, she could see that his scar was not a single line but a series of overlapping marks, as if someone had cut him in the same place more than once. She could see the amber of his eyes, the black ring around the iris, the way his pupils were still dilated. She could see the fine tremor in his jaw, the effort of holding his wolf back. "I do not know you," she said. He almost smiled. The scar pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You will," he said. He did not touch her wrists. He looked at them, at the raw, weeping blisters, and she saw his jaw tighten again. Then he shrugged off his coat, a heavy black thing lined with dark fur that smelled overwhelmingly of him, cedar and storm and wolf, and he put it around her shoulders. The warmth hit her like a wave, and she shuddered. "Rendell, the Alpha King, said without looking away from Sarah, your blood oath is accepted. Your pack will answer to my appointed beta, who will arrive in 3 days. You will vacate the Alpha quarters." She heard Rendell start to sputter. "And you will prepare a full account of every Omega in this pack, their treatment, their housing, their injuries. If I find that what has been done to my mate has been done to others, the consequences will extend beyond loss of title. Am I understood?" It was not a question. Sarah clutched the coat around her shoulders and breathed in the scent of cedar smoke, and felt her wolf, her impossible, hidden, silver-eyed wolf, settle against the inside of her chest like something that had finally found the place it was meant to be. She did not trust it. She did not trust him. She did not trust any of it, but for the first time in 6 years she was warm. The journey north took 3 days by convoy. The Alpha King's vehicles were black and armored and smelled inside like leather and gun oil and the faint mint of some cleaning solution. Sarah sat in the back of the lead vehicle with the coat still around her shoulders. She had not taken it off. She told herself this was because of the cold. The Alpha King sat across from her, not beside her, giving her the space that she had not asked for, but that he seemed to understand she needed. He was looking at a stack of papers, reports from his territories, but his eyes kept drifting to her face. She caught him at it twice. The first time he looked away. The second time he held her gaze and said, "I am going to keep looking at you. You might as well get used to it." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and pulled the coat tighter and watched the mountains scroll past the armored glass. His beta, a woman named Thessa with close-cropped red hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who did not believe in curves, sat in the front passenger seat and pretended not to notice the tension in the back. Thessa had been the first person other than the Alpha King to speak to Sarah after the oath ceremony. She had looked at Sarah's wrists, said, "I will get the medical kit," and returned with supplies and a proficiency with wound care that suggested significant field experience. She had cleaned and bandaged the blisters without small talk, which Sarah appreciated. When she was done, she had looked at Sarah and said, "He will not hurt you. I have known him since we were children. He will not hurt you." Sarah had said, "Everyone says that about their Alpha." Tessa had looked at her for a moment, then almost smiled. "Fair," she said. Now, 2 days into the journey, Sarah was beginning to understand the shape of the Alpha King's power. It was not just physical, though it was certainly that. When they stopped at a border checkpoint and the local pack Alpha came out to greet them, She watched through the window as the man, who was easily 250 pounds and had the swagger of someone accustomed to obedience, diminished visibly in the Alpha King's presence. Not because the king did anything overt. He simply existed at a frequency that made other alphas recalibrate their sense of their own significance. But it was the other thing she noticed, the unexpected thing that lodged in her mind. At the same checkpoint, a child, maybe 4 years old, the pack alpha's daughter by the look of her, had wandered past the guards and run directly into the Alpha King's legs. The checkpoint alpha went pale. Thessa's hand moved toward her weapon, and the Alpha King looked down at the child, who was staring up at him with the uncomplicated fearlessness of a 4-year-old, and he crouched and said, very seriously, "You have excellent tactical instincts. You flanked my entire guard." The child giggled. The checkpoint alpha looked like he was going to pass out. The Alpha King straightened, nodded at the man, and got back in the vehicle without mentioning it. Sarah watched the whole thing, and something in her chest, something adjacent to her wolf, but not the same thing, shifted uncomfortably. She did not want to like him. Liking him was dangerous. Every time she had liked someone in the Ashfall pack, it had been used against her. Rendell's mate, a quiet woman named Della, who had sometimes slipped an extra bread roll onto Sarah's tray in the kitchen. Sarah had liked Della, and Marin had noticed, and the bread rolls had stopped, and Della had started looking at Sarah with the particular expression of someone who had been told that kindness toward the Omega would have consequences. So Sarah did not like the Alpha King. She observed him. She noted his habits, the way he read reports with his left thumb pressed against his lower lip, the way he cracked his neck to the right before making a phone call, the way he drank his coffee black and too hot and winced slightly at the first sip every single time, as if he had not yet learned that coffee fresh off the heat would burn his tongue. She noted these things and she filed them away, and she did not like him. On the third morning, she woke in the vehicle, disoriented, and found that she had shifted in her sleep, and her head was resting against his shoulder. He was awake. He was reading. His arm was very carefully, very deliberately not moving, as if he had calculated the exact amount of stillness required to avoid waking her and was maintaining it with military precision. She sat up. He did not acknowledge it. He turned a page. The northern keep was not what she expected. She had imagined something cold and brutal, all stone and iron, a fortress designed to intimidate. And it was a fortress. The outer walls were 40 feet of reinforced granite. The gates were steel and ancient magic. The watchtowers bristled with wolves in their shifted forms. But inside those walls the keep was alive. There were gardens in the courtyards, dormant now in November but clearly tended, with the skeletal remains of climbing roses on the south-facing walls and neat beds of winter herbs, sage and thyme and rosemary, that released their scent when you brushed past them. There were windows, actual glass windows, not arrow slits, and they let in the thin mountain light and reflected it onto interior walls painted in warm ochre and deep red. There were fireplaces in every room she saw, and they were lit, and the whole interior of the keep smelled like burning applewood and bread. The bread smell confused her. She followed it, moving through the corridors behind Thessa, who was showing her to her quarters, and she realized it was coming from a kitchen somewhere below them. A real kitchen. Not the industrial horror of the Ashfall compound, all stainless steel and grease traps, but something that smelled like someone was actually cooking in it, because they wanted to. "Your rooms," Thessa said, stopping at a wooden door carved with a pattern of interlocking leaves. She opened it. "There is a bath, clothing, food. The Alpha King requests your presence at dinner, but does not require it. You may decline." Sarah stepped inside and stopped. The room was warm. There was a fire in the hearth, crackling softly, throwing orange light across a bed that was larger than the storage closet she had slept in at Ashfall. The bedding was dark blue, thick, layered. There was a chair by the window with a blanket folded over its arm. There was a desk with paper and ink. There was a wardrobe, and when she opened it, there were clothes inside, simple and well made, in sizes that were approximately correct. And there was a shelf of books, a small one, just 3 shelves, but it was full. She touched the spines. Herbalism, botany, a field guide to mountain wildflowers, an old leather-bound volume on wound care and natural remedies. She turned to Thessa, who was standing in the doorway. "How did he know?" Sarah said. Thessa shrugged. One of her rarer expressions. "He asked your former pack what you did in your free time. Apparently, one of the Omegas told him you used to read the herbal remedy books in the kitchen when you thought no one was watching." Sarah looked at the books. She looked at the fire. She looked at the bed. She sat down on the floor, because the floor was what she knew, and she pressed her back against the bed frame and she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way she always cried, which was silently with her face turned toward the wall, her shoulders shaking in small controlled increments, the sound swallowed before it could become a sound. Thessa closed the door quietly and left her alone. She went to dinner. She did not know why. She told herself it was strategic, that she needed to understand the politics of this place if she was going to survive it. This was partially true. The other truth, the one she did not examine too closely, was that the distance between her room and wherever the Alpha King was had started to ache. Physically, a dull pressure behind her sternum that her wolf was very insistent about. The dining hall was smaller than she expected. Not a great hall for hundreds, but a long room with a single oak table and maybe 30 chairs. Most were occupied by wolves she did not recognize. Kale's inner circle, she assumed, his advisors and senior warriors. They looked at her when she entered. She expected hostility, or at least the measuring assessment she was accustomed to from dominant wolves. What she got was something closer to curiosity, and from a few of them, careful nods of acknowledgement. The Alpha King was at the head of the table. He stood when she entered. Every wolf in the room watched him do it, and several of them exchanged glances that communicated something Sarah could not read. Thessa was seated to his left. There was an empty chair to his right. Sarah walked to it and sat down. The chair was solid oak and surprisingly comfortable, the seat worn smooth by years of use. She could smell the food, roasted venison and root vegetables, and that bread, the bread she had smelled earlier, warm and yeasty and golden brown in a basket at the center of the table. She could also smell him, this close. The cedar and storm scent was overwhelming, layered with the clean soap he had used, and the leather of his vest and something underneath all of it that was just him, just the warm animal reality of his skin. Her wolf was pressing against her ribs, leaning toward him with a gravitational insistence that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He did not speak to her immediately. He passed her the bread. She took a piece and held it, feeling the warmth of it in her hands, and she realized she could not remember the last time someone had passed her food instead of leaving it on the floor for her. She ate. The venison was seasoned with juniper and pepper, and the root vegetables had been roasted with butter and thyme until their edges were caramelized and crisp. She ate slowly, carefully, the way she always ate, which was the way people eat when they have spent enough years hungry that their stomach protests at sudden abundance. She took small bites and chewed thoroughly and set the fork down between each one. The Alpha King watched her eat, not staring, glancing. Short looks that he rationed as if he was aware that too much attention would spook her. She appreciated this more than she would admit. After the main course, when the table was clearing and the conversation had settled into the low, comfortable murmur of people who knew each other well, he turned to her. "You have a lunar wolf," he said. His voice was quiet, pitched for her ears only. She felt her spine stiffen. The instinct to deny was so deeply embedded it was almost reflexive. 6 years of hiding, of pressing her wolf down into the dark and the silence, of making herself small and wolfless and unremarkable because the alternative was being hunted. "I do not know what you mean," she said. He looked at her. The amber eyes were steady, patient. There was no challenge in them, no demand. Just the quiet certainty of a man who was used to waiting for the truth. "Your eyes went silver in the Oath Hall," he said. "I have read every historical account of the lunar bloodline. I know what silver eyes mean." He paused. "Who were your parents?" She did not answer for a long time. The fire crackled. Someone at the far end of the table laughed at a joke she could not hear. "I do not know," she said, and this was true. "I was left at the Ashfall compound when I was an infant. No note, no name. They called me Sarah because it was short and easy to yell across a kitchen. Something moved in his expression. Not pity. Anger, held on a very short leash. The lunar bloodline was not hunted to extinction, he said. It was driven underground. The old Alpha Council ordered the purge because they feared the lunar wolf's power. He leaned forward and his scent washed over her, and her wolf whined. You are not the last, but you may be the strongest. And I think the people who left you at Ashfall knew that. And I think they left you there because it was the last place anyone would look for a wolf of your bloodline. Sarah put down her fork. Her hands were trembling, very slightly, the only outward sign of the earthquake happening inside her. You cannot tell anyone, she said. He tilted his head. That almost smile again, the scar pulling at the corner of his mouth. I am the Alpha King. There is no one above me to tell. That is not what I mean. If other packs learn what I am, then they will come, he said, and they will find me between them and you. He said this the way he might have said the sky is blue or water is wet, a simple fact, not a boast. Every wolf who threatens my mate will learn what happens when you give the Northern King a reason to go to war. She stared at him. The firelight was in his eyes, turning the amber to liquid gold. You do not know me, she said, for the second time. I know that you knelt on cold stone for 5 hours without making a sound, he said. I know that you pressed your knee against a frightened girl to comfort her when your own wrists were burning. I know that you stood up in front of your entire pack and refused to kneel when kneeling would have been easier and safer and expected. He held her gaze. I know that someone carved a scar into your throat and you survived it. I know that you buried your wolf for 6 years to stay alive. He paused. I do not need to know your history to know your nature. Your nature announced itself the moment you opened your mouth. Sarah looked down at the table, at her hands still trembling, at the bandages on her wrists white against her brown skin. I am going to leave now, she said. He nodded. He did not try to stop her. He did not touch her. He said, breakfast is at 7. Tessa will show you the library in the morning if you want. She stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. Thank you for the books, she said, without turning around. She heard the chair creak as he leaned back, heard the small exhale through his nose that might have been a laugh. You are welcome, he said. 3 weeks passed. Sarah did not kneel, not once, not for anyone. The wolves of the Northern Keep noticed this and, after a brief period of confusion, adjusted. She was the Alpha King's mate. She was a lunar wolf, though this was known only to Kale, Thessa, and the Keep's healer, an ancient wolf named Gregor who had looked at her eyes and said, "Ah," and then spent 2 hours explaining the historical significance of her bloodline while she sat in his study drinking mint tea and trying not to feel overwhelmed. She did not share the Alpha King's bed. She slept in her own room, in the bed that was too soft and too warm, under the blue blankets, with a fire in the hearth. She woke every morning with her wolf oriented toward the north wing of the keep, where his quarters were, and she ignored this, the way you ignore a persistent headache, by focusing on something else. She found the kitchen, not because she was assigned to it, but because the smell drew her, the bread smell, and she followed it down 2 flights of stairs and through a heavy wooden door, and found a woman named Hilda, who was 63 years old and had arms like a blacksmith and a laugh that started in her belly and ended somewhere near the ceiling. Hilda ran the kitchen with the efficient benevolence of a woman who believed that food was a language and that everyone deserved to be spoken to in it. Sarah stood in the doorway that first morning, and Hilda looked at her and said, "If you are here to watch, sit down. If you are here to help, wash your hands. There is dough rising and it will not braid itself." Sarah washed her hands. She braided dough. She discovered that the bread she had been smelling was a traditional northern recipe, a dark rye with caraway seeds and molasses, and that Hilda had been making it every morning for 41 years. She learned the rhythm of the kitchen, the way Hilda timed her tasks so that the bread came out of the oven at exactly the moment the butter reached room temperature. She learned that Hilda's husband had been one of Kale's father's warriors, and had died in the border wars, and that Kale, who had been 14 at the time, had sat in this kitchen for 3 days after the funeral because his own quarters felt too large. "He still comes down here sometimes," Hilda said, punching dough with a force that seemed excessive but apparently was not. 3 in the morning, cannot sleep. Sits in that chair. She nodded toward a wooden chair in the corner that was noticeably more worn than the others. Does not talk. Sometimes I make him eggs. Sometimes I just let him sit. Sarah looked at the chair. She imagined the Alpha King sitting in it, too large for it. His legs stretched out, his head tipped back against the wall. She imagined him at 14, newly orphaned, sitting in a kitchen because it was the only room in a fortress that felt like it belonged to a person instead of a title. She stopped imagining and went back to braiding dough. The Alpha King gave her space. He did not crowd her, did not demand, did not push. He was present, consistently, unavoidably present, at meals and in the corridors and in the courtyard where she had begun taking morning walks, but he maintained a distance that she understood was deliberate and effortful. She could feel the mate bond pulling at him the same way it pulled at her, a constant low-frequency vibration between their bodies, like two tuning forks pitched to the same note. She could feel his wolf reaching for hers every time they were in the same room, and she could feel the effort it cost him to hold it back. He was restraining himself, for her. This made her uncomfortable in ways she could not articulate, so she articulated nothing and braided dough, and read the books in her room, and slowly, carefully like someone testing the ice on a frozen lake, she began to let her wolf surface, not fully. Not the silver eyes and the lunar power that Gregor had told her about, the ancient ability to heal and to command and to bond with any wolf regardless of pack. But the basic things, the enhanced senses, the heightened awareness, the ability to hear a heartbeat across a room, she let these come back, and her wolf stretched inside her like an animal that had been sleeping in a cage too small for it, stiff and aching and profoundly relieved. She was in the library on a Tuesday afternoon, reading a text on mountain herb cultivation, when she heard the commotion. Raised voices from the main hall, boots running. The sound of the great doors being thrown open, which was a sound that echoed through the entire keep like a bass drum. She closed the book and went to the source. The main hall was in chaos. Wolves were moving with purpose, the controlled urgency of a military operation in progress. Thessa was shouting orders, her granite face even more angular than usual with tension. Guards were posting at the doors, at the windows, at the internal checkpoints. In the center of the hall, the Alpha King stood with his arms crossed and his expression carved from ice. Next to him, held upright by 2 guards who were clearly struggling with the effort, was a woman Sarah recognized. Maren. Rendell's daughter was thinner than Sarah remembered. Her wheat blonde hair was tangled and dirty, and there was a bruise on her left cheekbone, the color of an overripe plum. Her clothing was torn and her hands were bound behind her back, and she was looking at the Alpha King with an expression that combined defiance and terror in roughly equal measure. Sarah stopped at the edge of the hall. The Alpha King's eyes found her immediately, the way they always did, as if he had a compass inside his chest that pointed constantly in her direction. She crossed the border 2 hours ago, Thessa said, moving to stand beside Kale. Alone. She says she has a message from the Ashfall pack. Maren's eyes shifted to Sarah, and there it was, the look Sarah knew so well, the proprietary assessment, the measuring of relative value. But it was different now. There was something underneath the familiar contempt, something that looked improbably like fear. "My father is coming," Maren said. Her voice was hoarse, as if she had been running or screaming or both. "He has made an alliance with the Crestfang and Ironmoor packs. 3 packs combined. He is coming for the Omega." She did not say Sarah's name. She said the Omega, the way you might say the furniture or the weather. "Why," the Alpha King said, "because she is lunar." Maren's chin lifted. He does not want her as a servant. He wants her as a weapon. The old texts say a lunar wolf can break any pack bond, command any wolf regardless of alpha blood. He wants to use her to challenge your rule. She paused. "And if he cannot have her, he will kill her. He will not allow a lunar wolf to exist under anyone's protection but his." The hall went quiet. Sarah could hear the fire in the great hearth, the pop and hiss of sap in the applewood logs. "And you," the Alpha King said to Maren, "why are you here? Why warn us?" Myron looked at the floor. Her jaw worked. When she spoke, her voice was different, stripped of the performative confidence Sarah remembered. Smaller. Younger. Because he was going to use me as bait, she swallowed. Send me ahead with a false message of peace. Let me get inside. And then, when the gates were open, she did not finish. Sarah looked at Maren, at the bruise on her cheekbone, at the way her hands bound behind her were gripping her own wrists, nails digging into skin. She thought about the stairs, the push, the long fall and the crack of her collarbone on the stone landing, and Maren standing at the top, looking down with that small proprietary smile. She thought about Maren at 12, before the cruelty had calcified into habit. She had a memory, blurred at the edges, of Maren in the Ashford kitchen sneaking honey from the jar with her finger, looking over her shoulder with a child's guilty grin, and seeing Sarah watching, and for just a moment, just one moment, offering the jar. Sarah had not taken it. She had already learned by then that sweetness from the Alpha's family always came with a cost. And Maren's face had closed, and the jar had been retracted, and something between them had sealed shut. She looked at Maren's bruise and thought about who had put it there. Give her food, Sarah said. The hall looked at her. The Alpha King looked at her. Give her food and clean clothes and a room that locks from the inside, Sarah said. She is not bait. She is a defector. Treat her like one. Maren stared at her. Something cracked in the defiance, just for a moment, like a stone wall with a single fracture running through it. She did not say thank you. She looked away. But the nails stopped digging into her wrists. The Alpha King studied Sarah for a long moment. Then he nodded at Thessa, who began issuing orders with brisk efficiency. He crossed the hall to Sarah. He stopped close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the electric pull of the bond, the pressure of his wolf against hers. You have a generous heart, he said. No, she said. I have a good memory. There is a difference. He looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that she had been avoiding naming for 3 weeks. It was not just desire, though there was that, obvious and enormous and held on a chain. It was not just protectiveness, though there was that too. It was a kind of wonder, the expression of a man who had expected to find a mate someday and had not expected to find this. Rendell has 3 days, he said, maybe less. We need to talk about what you can do. She knew what he meant. The lunar power, the thing Gregor had described in his study of a mentee, the ancient abilities of her bloodline, the reason an entire council had tried to wipe her kind from existence. I do not know what I can do, she said honestly. I have spent my entire life suppressing it. Then we need to find out. He held out his hand, palm up. Open, not demanding. Offering. Will you let me help? She looked at his hand. The calluses on his palm, the scars across his knuckles, the breadth of his fingers. She looked at his face, the scar, the amber eyes, the almost smile. She put her hand in his. The next 3 days were the strangest of Sarah's life. Gregor, the old healer, turned out to be not just a healer but a historian, and he had been quietly collecting texts on the lunar bloodline for decades. Ever since a dream he'd had as a young wolf that he described in terms so mystical and vague that Sarah could not follow them. His study was full of scrolls and leather-bound journals and hand-drawn diagrams of wolf anatomy that looked like they had been created by someone who was both very skilled and slightly unhinged. The lunar wolf, Gregor explained, pacing his study with the restless energy of a man who had waited 40 years to deliver this particular lecture, was not simply a different color of wolf. It was a different architecture of power. Standard alpha wolves commanded through dominance through the hierarchical structure of pack bonds. A lunar wolf did not command. It connected. It could feel the bonds between every wolf in range, could sense the threads that tied alpha to beta, beta to omega, and it could manipulate those threads, strengthen them, sever them, rewire them entirely. This is why the old council feared your kind, Gregor said, stopping mid-pace to fix her with eyes that were milky with age but fierce with intelligence. An Alpha King rules because pack bonds flow toward him. A lunar wolf could redirect those bonds, could make any wolf loyal to anyone, or to no one, could break an entire pack structure in an instant. Sarah sat in the worn leather chair in Gregor's study and felt cold despite the fire. "That is a terrible power," she said. Gregor nodded. "Which is why your ancestors chose not to use it for domination. They became healers, mediators, the wolves who held packs together when grief or war threatened to tear them apart." He paused. The council did not fear the power itself. They feared what would happen if someone without your ancestors' conscience gained access to it. Sarah thought about Rendell, about the alliance he had built to come for her, about the word Marin had used, weapon. "I will not be used," she said. Gregor smiled, which on his ancient craggy face looked like a tectonic event. "That," he said, "is exactly what a lunar wolf would say." The Alpha King trained with her, not combat, though she watched him train with his warriors and understood, with a visceral clarity, why other packs surrendered rather than fight him. He moved like something that should not be that fast at that size, with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of practice and a natural aptitude for violence that was, she had to admit, impressive in a way that was not entirely intellectual. What he trained with her was control. He had spent his own life learning to manage his wolf, which was one of the most powerful alpha wolves in recorded history, and which had a tendency, when his emotions ran high, to push for dominance in ways that were destructive. He understood suppression. He understood the calculus of holding something enormous inside you and releasing it in measured amounts. They worked in the courtyard, in the thin November sunlight, with Thessa standing guard at the gate, and Gregor watching from a window above. "Feel the bonds," the Alpha King said. He was standing 10 feet from her, arms crossed, in the same black clothing he always wore, the leather vest over a dark wool shirt, the worn boots. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and she could see the muscles in his forearms, the scars on his hands, the dark hair on his wrists. "Do not reach for them, just feel them. Let them come to you." She closed her eyes. She breathed. She let her wolf rise, not the silver eyes, not the full power, just the awareness. And she felt them, the bonds. Hundreds of them, thousands, thin threads of connection radiating from every wolf in the keep, crossing and tangling and weaving into a structure that she could sense the way a spider senses its web. She could feel Thessa's bond to Kale, thick and old and complicated, woven from loyalty and respect and the childhood friendship that had survived war and loss. She could feel the kitchen workers' bonds to each other, simple and warm, the bonds of people who spend their days in comfortable proximity. She could feel the warriors' bonds to their alpha, strong and bright and edged with the particular devotion of wolves who had followed their king into battle and come out alive. And she could feel the bond between herself and Kale. It was not like the others. It was wider, deeper, a river instead of a thread, and it pulsed with a warmth that made her breath catch. She could feel his heart beat through it, steady and strong, and she could feel his wolf, that massive presence, reaching toward her through the bond with a tenderness that was almost painful. She opened her eyes. He was watching her. The amber eyes were soft in a way she had only seen once before, when he had crouched to speak to the child at the checkpoint. "There you are," he said. She did not know what her expression was doing, but whatever it was, it made him take a step toward her, and then stop, and then take another, and then stop again, the leash on his control visibly straining. "I want to touch you," he said. The roughness in his voice was pronounced. "I want that very much, but I will not do it unless you ask." Sarah stood in the November courtyard with the cold air on her face and the warmth of 1,000 bonds humming through her body, and the river between herself and this man pulsing like a second heartbeat. She walked to him. She stopped close enough to feel his breath. She reached up and put her hand on his chest, over his heart, and felt it hammering against her palm, felt the vibration of his wolf leaning into her touch. "I am not asking," she said. "I am deciding." He made a sound, low, involuntary. His hand came up and covered hers, pressing it harder against his chest, and his other hand went to the back of her neck, fingers threading into her hair, and he pulled her forward and pressed his forehead against hers. They stood like that, not kissing, not moving, just breathing. Two wolves who had spent their lives at the center of storms, finding a stillness between them that neither had known they needed. "If Rendell comes," she said, her voice muffled against his collarbone, "I will not hide behind you." His chest vibrated with something that might have been a laugh. "I know," he said. "I mean it. I will not be protected. I will protect myself. And I will protect you, and this pack, and everyone in it. Because that is what a lunar wolf does." He pulled back far enough to look at her face. The almost smile, the scar, the amber eyes with the wolf burning behind them. "I know that too," he said. "Why do you think I knelt?" Rendell came at dawn on the fourth day. Sira was in the kitchen with Hilda, braiding dough, her hands coated in flour, her wolf alert inside her chest, when she heard the horns. Not the ceremonial horns of the oath hall, war horns, deep and long and resonant with a particular frequency that made every wolf in the keep stop what they were doing and orient toward the gates. Hilda put down her dough. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. "Go," she said to Sarah. "He will need you at the wall." Sarah wiped the flour from her hands. She walked through the corridors of the keep, and wolves moved aside for her as she passed, not because she demanded it, but because they had, in 3 weeks, come to understand that the quiet Omega with the silver eyes and the flour-dusted apron was not what they had initially assumed. She reached the main wall. The Alpha King was there, standing at the battlement, looking out over the valley that approached the keep from the south. Thessa was beside him, armed, her granite face set in an expression of professional anticipation. Warriors lined the walls, shifted and unshifted, their bodies tense with the particular readiness of wolves who knew their alpha would not flinch, and therefore could not flinch themselves. Sierra stood beside Kale and looked. The valley was full of wolves. Not dozens, hundreds. 3 packs, their colors distinct even at this distance, Ashfalls gray and brown, Crestfangs black, Ironmoors red. They moved through the valley like a dark river, spreading to fill the space between the tree lines, and at their head, on a slight rise, she could see Rendell. He was shifted. His wolf was large for a standard alpha, gray with a darker saddle across the shoulders, and he stood on the rise with his head lifted and his hackles raised. Beside him, in human form, was a man Sarah did not recognize, tall and thin with white hair that caught the early light. Crestfan Alpha, and on the other side a woman, heavy-set and scarred, her shifted wolf already snarling. Ironmoor, 3 alphas, 3 packs, maybe 500 wolves. "How many do we have?" Sarah asked. "In the keep?" 200. Kale's voice was calm, factual. "On the way from the eastern territories. Another 300, but they will not arrive before noon." She did the math. 6 hours of being outnumbered more than 2 to 1. The Alpha King looked at her. He was not afraid. She could feel that through the bond, the absolute absence of fear. Not because he was reckless, but because he had done this before and he understood his own capabilities and he had already accepted every possible outcome, including the worst. "I could break their pack bonds," she said. He was silent for a moment. "That would win the battle in minutes," he said. "And it would prove every fear the old council had about the lunar bloodline." She looked at the army in the valley, at the wolves who were there because their alphas had ordered them to be there. Wolves who were afraid and obedient and following the bond structure that had governed their lives since birth. She could feel those bonds now, hundreds of thin threads pulling those wolves forward, dragging them toward a fight many of them did not want. "No," she said, "I will not break them. But I can do something else," she told him. He listened. His expression did not change, but she felt through the bond a pulse of something fierce and bright. "Do it," he said. The army reached the gates at full dawn. Rendell, shifted back to human form, stood at the front in ceremonial armor that looked new and fit poorly, as if he had ordered it recently and had lost weight since the fitting. His voice, amplified by a speaker one of his wolves held, echoed off the keep walls. "Alpha King Kael Dravos, I, Rendell Voss, demand the surrender of the lunar wolf you harbor. She is property of the Ashfall pack, claimed under ancient salvage law, and her blood belongs to the pack that raised her. Surrender her now and your keep will be spared. Refuse and 3 packs will take her by force." The Alpha King said nothing. He looked at Sarah. She nodded. She stepped up onto the battlement. The wind caught her hair, which had grown in 3 weeks, dark and thick, no longer matted and unwashed, but clean and tangled by the wind. She was still wearing her kitchen clothes. There was flour on her sleeve. She closed her eyes. She reached for the bonds, not to break them, not to sever, or manipulate, or rewire. She reached for them the way Gregor had described her ancestors doing, the way a healer reaches for a wound, not to tear it wider, but to understand its shape. She felt 500 wolves. She felt their fear, their anger, their exhaustion. She felt the pack bonds pulling them forward, chains of loyalty and hierarchy and submission that had been forged over generations. She felt the 3 alpha bonds at the top, Rendell and Crestfang and Ironmore, thick and dominant, pulling all the others behind them like a net. And she did not break the net. She loosened it, not by force, by offering an alternative. She let her lunar power flow outward, not as a command, but as an invitation. A single thought unnamed said, "You do not have to be here. The bonds that hold you are real, but they are not the only bonds that exist. There is a choice you did not know you had." It was the gentlest use of power she could imagine. And it was devastating. The wolves in the valley hesitated. Not all of them, not at once. But a ripple passed through the army, a collective flinch, as 500 wolves simultaneously felt the tension on their pack bonds ease by a fraction. Enough to think, enough to look around and wonder why they were here, in the cold, facing a keep full of warriors, because their alpha had told them to be. A wolf at the back of the Ironmore contingent sat down. Then another. Then a cluster of Crestfang wolves stopped moving forward and simply stood, their ears uncertain, their tails lowering from aggressive to neutral. Rendell spun toward his army. "What are you doing?" he screamed, the speaker amplifying his voice into a distorted shriek. "Move. Attack. I command you to." But the bonds were loose. And wolves who could think were wolves who could choose. And many of them, feeling the lunar wolf's gentle invitation, chose to stop. Not all. The core loyalists, the wolves bound tightest to their alphas, the ones who had internalized the hierarchy so deeply it was indistinguishable from identity, those wolves kept coming. Maybe 200 of them, still a significant force. The Alpha King looked at Sarah. She stepped back from the battlement. "My turn," he said. He shifted. Sarah had not seen his wolf. She had felt it, through the bond, the enormous pressure of it, the sense of something vast and barely contained. But she had not seen it. His wolf was black. Not dark gray, not charcoal. Black, the absolute black of a deep cave, of a moonless night, of the space between stars. It was the largest wolf she had ever seen, standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, with amber eyes that burned like embers in the dark. When it landed on the ground outside the gates, the impact was felt in the walls. He did not roar. He did not posture. He walked toward the oncoming wolves with the same unhurried stride the man used, the stride of something that had never needed to prove itself. The remaining attackers hit him like a wave hitting a cliff. He did not go down. He did not even stop walking. He moved through them with a precision that was almost surgical, each strike targeted, each movement economical. He broke formations the way you break sticks, with minimal effort and maximum effect. 2 wolves went down in the first 3 seconds, 4 more in the next 5. His own warriors poured from the gates behind him, and the battle devolved into a roaring, snarling chaos of fur and blood and stone. Sarah watched from the wall. She kept her power extended, the loosening field, giving every wolf in range the option to disengage. Many did. They peeled away from the fight in 1s and 2s, slinking to the edges, dropping their aggression, becoming wolves instead of soldiers. Rendell went for the Alpha King directly. His grey wolf launched itself at the black with a snarl that echoed off the valley walls. It was brave, in a stupid way. It was the act of a man who had run out of options and decided that death in combat was preferable to the humiliation of surrender. The Alpha King caught Rendell's wolf by the throat. Not a killing grip. A holding grip, controlled, deliberate. He bore the grey wolf to the ground, his massive paw on Rendell's chest, his jaws around Rendell's throat, and he held him there while the remaining fighters stopped fighting and stared. Sarah climbed down from the wall. She walked through the gate, through the aftermath of the battle, past injured wolves and surrendered wolves and wolves who watched her with expressions ranging from awe to terror. The flower on her sleeve was streaked with dust. She stopped in front of the Alpha King's wolf. He was holding Rendell down, amber eyes fixed on the grey wolf beneath him, and she could feel through the bond the effort it was costing him not to close his jaws. His wolf wanted to kill. Every instinct, every territorial imperative, every protective drive screamed at him to crush the throat of the man who had burned his mate's wrists with wolfsbane and let his daughter carve a scar into her throat. Sarah put her hand on his muzzle. His wolf went still. Every muscle locked. Those amber eyes swiveled to her, and in them she saw the war, the beast and the man and the king, all fighting over the same question. "He is not worth your teeth," she said. The Alpha King held for one more second. 2, 3. Then his jaws opened, and he released Rendell's throat, and the grey wolf collapsed on the churned ground, breathing in ragged, wet gasps. Sarah looked down at Rendell, at the wolf who had branded her, who had assigned her to grease traps and floor scrubbing and wolfsbane bindings, who had traded her like currency. "Get up," she said. Rendell shifted. The man who emerged was smaller than she remembered. Thinner. His hair, which had been iron grey, was now mostly white. There was blood on his face, not his own, and his eyes were wide and glassy with the particular expression of a man whose understanding of the world had just been fundamentally revised. She remembered a morning, years ago, early in her time at Ashfall, when she had been maybe 14. Rendell had found her in the kitchen garden at dawn. She had been picking mint for Della, who had a headache, and Rendell had stood at the garden gate and watched her for a moment before she noticed him. And for that one moment, before he saw her see him, his face had held something she had never seen there before or since. A kind of weary recognition, as if he was looking at her and seeing something that exhausted him. Not hatred, exhaustion. The look of a man who knew exactly what she was and what he was supposed to do about it, and was very, very tired of the whole arrangement. Then he had seen her looking, and his face had closed, and he had told her to stop wasting time in the garden and get back to the kitchen, and that was that. She thought about that moment now, looking at him on the ground. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not what this was. "You knew what I was," she said, "from the beginning. That is why you kept me in the kitchen, not because I was worthless, but because you were afraid. If I had been worthless, you would have thrown me out. You kept me close because you needed to watch me." Rendell said nothing. He looked at the ground. His hands were shaking. The Alpha King, shifted back to human form, stood behind Sarah. She could feel his heat at her back, his wolf pressing against hers through the bond. He did not touch her. He did not need to. "Rendell Voss," the Alpha King said, "your pack is dissolved. Your title is stripped. Your walls will be absorbed into the Northern Dominion under new leadership. You will be held in the border territories under guard for the remainder of your life. Your allies from Crestfang and Ironmoor will receive similar terms." He paused. "You are alive because my mate chose mercy. Remember that." Guards came forward. Rendell was pulled to his feet and led away, and his shoulders were slumped in a way that made him look, for the first time, like what he actually was, which was a tired, frightened man who had made nothing but bad decisions for decades, and had finally run out of room to maneuver. The battlefield quieted. The surrendered wolves were being gathered, tended, sorted. The injured were being carried toward the keep. The dead, of which there were fewer than Sarah had feared, were being laid in rows near the tree line. Sarah stood in the churned mud and looked at the sky, which was the pale grey blue of early winter, and she felt her wolf inside her. Not hidden, not buried, not caged, just there, settled against her ribs like something that had always belonged. The Alpha King stood beside her, close enough to touch. "Not touching. The mate bond," she said. "Yes, it has been pulling at me for 3 weeks. I know." He paused. "It has been pulling at me since the moment I walked into that oath hall and smelled juniper and something I had no name for." She looked at him, the scar on his jaw. The amber eyes dimmer now, the wolf receding, the man returning, the blood on his hands, other people's blood, the blood of wolves who had come for her. "I do not want a marking ceremony," she said. He blinked. It was the first time she had seen him surprised by something she said, genuinely surprised, not the controlled acknowledgement he usually offered. "I do not want a public ceremony with witnesses and rituals and speeches," she said. "I have had enough of kneeling in front of crowds." She paused. "If we do this, I want it to be just us, in a room, with no one watching." His almost smile deepened. The scar pulled. His eyes warmed. "Name the room," he said. "The kitchen," she said. He laughed. An actual laugh, low and rough and real, and it was the first time she had heard it, and her wolf pressed against her ribs with a warmth that was almost unbearable. They did it at 3 a.m, in Hilda's kitchen, with the fire burning low and the smell of yeast and caraway seeds in the air. Hilda was not there, but the dough she had set for the morning was rising under a cloth on the counter, and the kitchen was warm and close and smelled like bread and applewood smoke. Sarah sat in the worn chair in the corner, the chair where a 14-year-old boy had sat after his father's funeral, and the Alpha King knelt in front of her for the second time, and this time she did not tell him to get up. He took her wrists. The blisters had healed, but the scars remained, thin white lines where the wolfsbane had burned deepest. He pressed his lips to each scar, and she felt the touch through the bond like a bell being struck. "I will never bind you," he said against her skin. "I will never cage your wolf. I will never ask you to kneel." She put her hands on either side of his face. She felt the scar under her left thumb, the roughness of his jaw under her right. She felt his heartbeat through his skin, fast and hard. The heart of a man who commanded armies without flinching, but was trembling in a kitchen at 3 a.m. because the woman he loved was touching his face. She tilted his head and pressed her mouth to the scar on his jaw, and his breath caught and his hands tightened on her wrists, and his wolf surged forward to meet hers through the bond. She marked him first. Her teeth found the junction of his neck and shoulder, the traditional marking point, and she bit down, not gently, with the full force of a lunar wolf claiming her mate. And he made a sound that was not pain and not pleasure, but something entirely its own, a sound that belonged to them alone. She felt the bond lock into place, felt it shift from a river to an ocean, felt every thread of connection between them crystallize into something permanent and unbreakable. Then he marked her, his teeth on her neck, his hands in her hair, the heat of him surrounding her, and the bond completed, and her wolf howled inside her chest, silver and wild and free, and the sound resonated through every bond in the keep, through every wolf in range, a signal that could not be mistaken. The lunar wolf had chosen her mate. The northern king had been claimed. In the room above the kitchen, Hilda woke up, smiled, rolled over, and went back to sleep. 7 months later, Sarah stood in the courtyard of the northern keep, her hands in the soil of the garden she had planted where the dormant roses had been. The sage and thyme and rosemary were thriving, and she had added lavender and chamomile and a wild mint that she had found growing in the cracks of the outer wall. The garden smelled like a remedy, which was appropriate because that was what she used it for. She was the keep's healer now, not by appointment, by practice. The wolves of the Northern Dominion had learned, gradually and then all at once, that the quiet woman with the silver eyes and the flower-dusted sleeves could do things with a handful of herbs and a lunar wolf's touch that no traditional healer could match. She could feel the bonds between wolves, could sense where they were strained or damaged, could mend them with a combination of botanical knowledge and an ancient power that she was still learning to use, but that came more naturally every day. Pell was here. Sarah had sent for her specifically, the trembling 16-year-old from the Oath Circle, who was now 17 and slightly less trembling and working as Sarah's apprentice in the herb garden and the healing rooms. Pell had a talent for plants and a quiet steadiness that emerged once the fear receded. Marin was here too, which was stranger. She lived in the eastern wing, kept largely to herself, and worked in the keep's administrative office doing inventory and record keeping. She and Sarah did not speak often. When they did, The conversations were short and careful, two people navigating the wreckage of a history that could not be undone. Once, passing in the corridor, Maren had stopped and said, "The scar. I am not going to apologize, because an apology would be obscene, but I want you to know that I remember exactly what I did, and I remember why. And the why was that I was 14 and terrified of my father, and you were the only person in that pack who had less power than me, and I chose to take yours rather than face mine." She had not waited for a response. She had walked away. Sarah had stood in the corridor for a long time after that, thinking about the honey jar. Now Sarah knelt in her garden, and the irony of kneeling voluntarily in soil instead of on stone, choosing the posture instead of being assigned to it, was not lost on her. Her wolf hummed contentedly inside her chest, silver and settled, aware of every bond in the keep, the vast web of connections that she tended the way she tended the garden, with patience and attention, and the understanding that living things grow best when they are not forced. She heard his footsteps behind her. She always heard them. Not because they were loud, but because her entire body was calibrated to him, tuned to his frequency, the way a compass is tuned to north. He crouched beside her. His hand went to the small of her back, warm and steady, and she leaned into it without deciding to. "You have dirt on your face," he said. "I have dirt on everything. I am gardening." He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her temple, and she felt the bond pulse between them, that vast ocean, warm and deep and permanent. "Regor says the Eastern Packs want to send their healers to study with you," Ray said. 3 requests this week." She tamped down the soil around a chamomile seedling. "Are they asking, or are you telling them to ask?" He made a sound that was not quite a denial. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, at the scar, at the amber eyes, at the marking scar on his neck, the one she had put there, visible above the collar of his shirt. He was still enormous and still intimidating and still the most powerful wolf in 7 territories. And he was kneeling in her garden, getting dirt on his knees because she was here, and that was where he wanted to be. She pulled a sprig of mint from the bed beside her and held it up. He took it. He smelled it. He tucked it into the pocket of his vest, where she knew it would stay for the rest of the day. Because he did this every time, kept whatever small green thing she handed him, as if it were a document of state importance. She turned back to her garden. The morning light was thin and cool, and the soil was dark and damp under her fingers. And somewhere, inside the keep, Hilda was baking bread, and the smell drifted through the courtyard. Warm and yeasty and alive,